Minnesota Somali community leaders are now pleading with the health department to undo its plans to cut off child care funding. Garrett Tenney has the latest live from Chicago. Garrett?
Yeah, Mike, and police in Minneapolis are also investigating a break-in at a daycare center. Now, this particular daycare center was not featured in Nick Shirley's viral video, but it is one of the dozens flagged to state investigators earlier this year for receiving more than $1 million in federal funding, despite having multiple and repeated violations on record. The owners of Nokomis Daycare say surveillance cameras captured two men breaking into their business, claiming they cut through an outside cinder block wall, crawled through an interior wall, and busted their way in before getting into an office and stealing business records, including personal information of who attends the daycare. Here's the center's manager.
One video made by a specific individual made this all happen. Yesterday was our daycare. Tomorrow might be someone else's. We don't know. So this has to stop.
While the Minneapolis police are investigating this reported break-in, some are suggesting it could be a cover-up of wrongdoing, including the HHS official who paused federal funding to Minnesota daycare this week. Alex Adams posted, "Crazy coincidence that attendance records are missing one day after the HHS secretary requested them from the state of Minnesota." Minnesota Democrats, meanwhile, are continuing to defend their handling of the alleged fraud in the state and attacking the Trump administration for freezing more than $190 million in federal funding as it investigates what prosecutors say could be more than $9 billion of fraud in the state.
We're taking fraud seriously. We're working every day to improve our systems, hold those criminals accountable, and move our state forward. That's why it's incredibly frustrating to me that Donald Trump and Republicans want to use this as a political vehicle to cut funding entirely to our state.
At 6:42 a.m., St. Paul sat under a hard winter freeze. The streets in the Southern District were empty, the kind of quiet that makes every sound feel louder than it should. A thin haze of exhaust rose from 3 unmarked SUVs idling at the curb. Inside them, 11 federal inspectors waited calm, focused, and dressed for a day that was supposed to be boring. On paper, this wasn't a raid. It wasn't a hunt. It wasn't even an investigation in the way the public imagines investigations. It was a compliance visit routine, procedural, filed into the same category as audits and renewals and checklists. The inspectors had clipboards and credentials. Their mission was simple: verify that a state-licensed child care center was operating within the rules. The center belonged to a director with a spotless reputation. Her record, according to licensing databases, looked like exactly what every system hopes to find. Multiple locations, steady enrollment numbers, and paperwork that was always complete. She managed 5 childcare sites across the Twin Cities area. The files claimed she was caring for more than 800 children every day, and because the numbers were so high, the subsidies arrived right on time like clockwork, month after month. That clockwork regularity was precisely why anyone was standing on this frozen curb at 6:42 in the morning. Over several years, the payments to her network had grown into the kind of figure that stops being a budget line and starts becoming a question. The total was too large to ignore, too smooth, too consistent. The system hadn't screamed, it had simply repeated itself so perfectly that repetition began to look like reliability. When the lead inspector stepped out and approached the front door, the first sign that something was wrong wasn't a locked handle or a suspicious person. It was silence. No parents dropping off kids, no small voices echoing down a hallway, no movement behind the windows. The inspector keyed the lock and pushed the door open. Inside, the air was stale and cold. The room felt wrong immediately, not in a dramatic, obvious way, but in a subtle way that made instinct speak before evidence did. Toys sat arranged in perfect rows on shelves, but a fine layer of dust lay over them as if no one had touched them in weeks. Cribs stood assembled in the nursery, but the bedding was pristine. Attendance sheets were posted neatly on the wall, filled out in careful blue ink. Every box was checked, every name accounted for, every day recorded. And yet, the building had no signs of life. In that single location alone, the subsidies over the last year had reached tens of millions. The paperwork insisted hundreds of children had spent full days there. But the room itself had the stillness of a stage after the audience leaves props in place. Lights out. No footprints on the floor. The compliance visits stopped being routine the moment inspectors stepped into the director's private office and saw what was sitting on the desk. A heavy binder, thick with lists, rosters, enrollment records, identity packets. It looked legitimate at first glance. Too legitimate. Because when agents began flipping through the pages, they noticed patterns no childcare operation would ever produce. The names were too clean, the entries too consistent, the structures too perfect. Then the realization landed with the force of a physical object. These weren't just inflated numbers. They were synthetic identities children that existed on paper and in databases, but nowhere else. The file described a method that blended stolen details with fabricated documents, producing ghost children that could move effortlessly through the payment system because the system was designed to pay quickly, not interrogate deeply. At that point, the inspectors weren't standing in a daycare. They were standing inside a machine designed to turn public compassion into private profit. If the story ended there, it would still be one of the largest betrayals a social program can endure, money allocated for working families redirected by fraud. But the file you provided insists the discovery went further past deception, into a darker category altogether. In the corner of the office, bolted to the floor, was a steel safe. Not the kind of lockbox a small business uses for petty cash. The kind of safe installed when you expect to store something that cannot be replaced. When a forensic locksmith forced it open, what was inside wasn't just paperwork. It was cash bundled and wrapped, stacked in a way that suggested practice, not panic. And on top of the cash were packages stamped with an insignia and unmistakable mark meant to send a message to anyone who understood it. This money was no longer just stolen. It belonged to a network bigger than one person, bigger than one building, bigger than one state program. That is the moment the narrative changes shape. Because welfare fraud is a crime of greed, but money laundering is a crime of architecture. It means systems have been built, roots, layers, intermediaries, routines. It means there are people beyond the front-facing operator who expect the money to arrive and have designed a pipeline to make sure it does. By mid-morning, auditors pulled deep records tied to licensing numbers, reimbursement schedules, and the web of accounts connected to the childcare network. And what they found was not a few suspicious transactions, but a pattern so extensive it could only have survived by blending into normalcy. Funds moved through dozens of intermediary accounts before being redistributed. Transfers were structured into amounts that avoided triggering automatic alerts. Legitimate expenses, food, rent, payroll formed a small fraction of the flow. The rest moved outward, away from the point of origin, as if the system's goal wasn't operating childcare at all, but extracting value from the idea of childcare. In this kind of scheme, paperwork is not a side detail. Paperwork is the weapon. The roster isn't merely a list, it's a key. The form isn't a form. It's a lever, and the system designed to deliver support quickly to families who need it becomes the perfect target because speed can be exploited, and the fear of denying legitimate claims can become a shield for illegitimate ones. The file describes another layer one that feels almost cinematic in its audacity, the use of staged appearances to create the illusion of normal operations, cars arriving during the right hours, sound designed to suggest activity, props moved between locations, an audience of one, as the transcript implies the inspector who might otherwise ask why the building felt so quiet. Whether or not every detail is literally true, the point of the narrative is unmistakable. The fraud survived not because it was invisible, but because it looked acceptable at a glance. It was built to pass casual inspection, to satisfy a checklist, to slide through the gaps between responsibility and routine. Then the story accelerates. Late that night, just before midnight, according to the transcript, prosecutors authorized a coordinated operation. This was no longer an inspection. It was a sweep. Multiple childcare facilities linked to the same network were approached simultaneously, along with affiliated offices that appeared to function as administrative hubs. And as teams moved in, alarms triggered not the kind you hear, but the kind you see on screens. Money began to move fast. Funds rerouted in minutes through tunnels designed to collapse after activation. Someone, somewhere, had been watching. Someone knew the moment the door opened. That's the terrible truth about modern fraud at scale. The building is just the front door. The real operation lives in systems accounts, transfers, encrypted messages, timed movements. You can enter one room and still be late to stop the real escape because the real escape happens in digits. As investigators tracked the flow outward, the file describes a second location, an industrial property listed as abandoned, but behaving like something very much alive. Utility usage spiked at night. Water consumption suggested heavy operations. Aerial monitoring confirmed movement. Vehicles entering in timed intervals. Vents pushing out heat. A pattern that didn't match emptiness, but matched production. This is where a story becomes not just a scandal, but an indictment of how systems can be repurposed. Public money diverted from childcare, laundered through paperwork, and according to the transcript connected to industrial-scale criminal production. The narrative insists that when the site was entered, the conditions felt hazardous, the infrastructure sophisticated, and the operation massive. And then the most human part of the story appears. People. Not numbers, not accounts. People found in the wrong place for the wrong reasons. Individuals described as frightened, exhausted, and treated as disposable in a system that only values output. The transcript frames them as ghosts, not because they were invisible, but because the operation had tried to erase their trace. Here, it's important to say this carefully. Stories like this can easily become exploitative if told for shock alone. The point isn't the sensational detail. The point is the mechanism. When money becomes the objective, human beings become collateral. And when oversight becomes procedural, compassion becomes an opening for predation. By morning, the file describes a federal briefing, numbers tallied, damages estimated. The costs weren't just monetary, though. The monetary figure was staggering. The greater harm was structural. Legitimate providers unable to compete with a fraud ring that didn't pay real expenses, families losing access as resources were drained, communities dealing with suspicion and backlash, and public trust turning brittle. Because this is what large-scale fraud does. It doesn't only steal money, it steals confidence. It makes people suspicious of the very programs designed to help. It turns debates about care into debates about punishment, and it invites the worst kind of opportunists, those who want to weaponize one scandal into hatred toward entire groups. The transcript explicitly mentions backlash against a local community after the investigation, and that detail matters because it reveals the second wave of damage. When a system fails, it often takes innocent people with it. And that is where the story should end, not with a villain monologue, not with a triumphal victory lap, but with the question that matters most in real life. If a network can feed on public funds for years by mastering paperwork, if approvals can become automated and repetition can be mistaken for reliability, if oversight can become a ritual instead of a safeguard, then the question isn't just who did this. The harder question is what conditions allowed it to keep working. Because the most dangerous threats rarely announce themselves with masks and weapons. They arrive in stamped forms, completed fields, and polite compliance. They succeed when systems are built for speed, when accountability is fragmented, when no one wants to be the person who slows down payments meant for families. The building can be shut down, accounts can be frozen, warrants can be filed. But the vulnerability remains if the incentives remain. Pay fast, verify later, assume good faith, and punish the whistleblower who asks why the numbers look too perfect. So the final question isn't just about one network. It's about every quiet building with a flawless spreadsheet and no life inside. How many other doors could open tomorrow morning to reveal the same emptiness, perfect rows of toys, pristine cribs, and paperwork that claims a world that doesn't exist? And what will we change before the next 6:42 a.m. visit turns into another storm?